I didn't mean to take off my wedding ring that night. It wasn't a decision, not at first. I was turning it absently with my thumb the way I always did when I was tired or anxious or both, and at some point it just slipped free. I felt the cool absence on my finger before I even realized what I'd done. I looked down at the gold band resting in my palm, catching the dim amber glow from the bar lights, and for a moment I couldn't remember why I'd worn it for so long. Then I slipped it into my pocket and tried not to think about what that meant. The hotel bar was nearly empty. It was the kind of place that existed only for people like me, business travelers with nowhere else to be, killing time between checkout and whatever came next. The bartender was polishing glasses at the far end of the counter, and somewhere in the corner a television murmured news no one was watching. I sat at a small table near the window, nursing a whiskey I didn't really want, watching the condensation slide down the glass. Adrian was sitting across from me. He'd arrived that afternoon to consult on the museum project my firm had been drowning in for months. We'd exchanged emails, sat through video calls where his face was just another square on a screen, but this was the first time we'd spoken in person. He was younger than I expected, 35, maybe, with dark hair that fell just slightly too long across his forehead and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. We talked about the project at first. Safe territory. He had ideas I hadn't considered, solutions to problems I'd been circling for weeks. But then the conversation drifted, the way it does late at night when you're tired and the person across from you feels like a stranger in the best possible way. He asked me how long I'd been an architect. I told him since I was a kid, drawing houses in the margins of my schoolwork. He smiled at that. He said he understood. At some point he said something. I don't even remember what it was exactly. Something about my voice. That it was steady, calm. That it made him feel like everything would be fine even when it wasn't. I laughed, too quickly, and brushed it off the way you do when someone says something kind and you don't know how to hold it. But I felt heat rise to my face, a flush I couldn't control, and when I looked up Adrian was watching me with this quiet, knowing smile. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me like he'd discovered something I'd been trying to hide. I finished my drink faster than I should have. I told him I needed to get some sleep. He nodded, said he'd see me tomorrow, and we shook hands like colleagues, like professionals, like nothing had shifted between us. But my hand burned where his had been. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone. The screen was dark, blank, waiting. I thought about Evelyn asleep back home in Charleston, about Lydia's ballet recital I'd missed last week, about the life I'd built so carefully it felt like a museum exhibit, beautiful, untouchable, behind glass. Then my phone lit up. A message from Adrian. I can't stop seeing that look on you. I read it 3 times. 4. I tried to think of what to say back, what the right response was, what a responsible man with a wife and a daughter and a mortgage would type in that moment. But I didn't reply. I just sat there holding the phone, staring at those 8 words until they blurred. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the window in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. I looked at my reflection in the glass, split, fractured by raindrops running down the pane. I looked like 2 people. The man I'd always been, steady and composed, and someone else beneath him. Someone I didn't recognize. Someone I was afraid to meet. I set the phone down on the nightstand, screen still glowing. I didn't turn it off. I didn't delete the message. I just lay back on the bed and listened to the rain and wondered if this was how it started, the unraveling of a life you thought was solid. I wondered if I'd already made a choice without meaning to. Back home in Charleston, my life had always been defined by order, by repetition, by the careful architecture of routine that kept everything standing upright even when the foundation felt uncertain. Mornings began before sunrise. I'd wake to the alarm at 5:30, dress in the dark so I wouldn't disturb Evelyn, and go downstairs to make coffee in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of the lavender cleaner she used every Sunday. I'd sit at the table with my laptop, reviewing emails and drafts while the house slept around me, and by the time Evelyn came down we'd exchange our usual good mornings, polite, functional, like co-workers sharing a shift. I drove Lydia to school most days. She was 11, quiet like me, always lost in a book or sketching something in the margins of her homework. Sometimes she'd tell me about her day, about a friend or a test or something funny that happened at recess, and I'd listen and nod and feel grateful that she still wanted to talk to me. Other times we'd drive in comfortable silence, the radio playing soft jazz, and I'd glance at her in the rearview mirror and wonder if she could see the distance growing in me. At the firm, I buried myself in work. Blueprints and elevations and endless revisions that no longer excited me the way they once had. I used to love this. The puzzle of structure and beauty, the way a building could tell a story if you listened closely enough. But somewhere along the way it had become just another task, another obligation, another thing I did because it was what I'd always done. My colleagues admired my discipline. They called me reliable, steady. No one ever asked if I was happy. Evelyn and I had been married for 13 years. We'd met in college, fallen into love the way people do when they're young and certain the world will bend to their plans. She was kind, competent, endlessly patient with me even when I didn't deserve it. She managed our home, our finances, our social calendar with the precision of an engineer. She was a good mother, a good wife, a good person, but we'd stopped touching years ago. Not dramatically. There was no fight, no moment of refusal. It just happened gradually, the way glaciers recede. We slept side by side in our king-sized bed, each of us clinging to our own edge, and in the mornings we'd wake and dress and move through our routines without ever acknowledging the canyon between us. We didn't fight. We didn't shout. We barely disagreed. We simply existed in parallel, two people sharing an address and a last name and a daughter, but little else. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me across the dinner table with an expression I couldn't read, sadness, maybe, or resignation. But she never said anything, and neither did I. Our home was beautiful. Evelyn had taste. The furniture was mid-century modern, all clean lines and muted colors. The walls were decorated with framed prints we bought on a trip to New York years ago, back when we still took trips. Everything was tidy, tasteful, carefully curated. It looked like the kind of house that should hold happiness. But it felt like a museum. Beautiful and untouchable and empty. On weekends, when I could escape, I drove to the harbor. There was a spot near the old customs house where you could sit on a bench and watch the water and sketch the historic buildings that line the waterfront. I'd bring my old leather notebook, the one I'd had since grad school, its pages warped and coffee-stained, and I'd draw until the light faded and my hand cramped. It was the only time I felt like myself. The only time I remembered that beauty once meant something more than precision, more than getting the measurements right and the client satisfied. When I drew, I wasn't Julian Reed, husband and father and senior architect. I was just someone trying to capture light. Evelyn thought it was a hobby, a quirky habit of mine, harmless and slightly impractical, but ultimately endearing. She'd tell her friends at dinner parties that I was artistic, that I still sketched in my spare time, and they'd smile and nod like it was charming. None of them understood that it was the only thing keeping me tethered. When the firm was chosen for the museum collaboration, a high-profile project with a firm out of Atlanta, Adrian's firm, I volunteered to lead the coordination immediately. My partners were surprised. I usually avoided the administrative headaches of collaboration, preferred to stay in my office with my drawings. But I told them I thought it would be good for my career, good for the firm's reputation, and they believed me. Evelyn praised my ambition. She said she was proud of me for stepping up, for taking on more responsibility. She didn't ask why I suddenly cared about advancement after years of contentment. She didn't see that I was chasing something I couldn't name, a pulse beneath the surface of my life, a tremor that told me I was still capable of feeling something. I told myself it was about the work, about the challenge, about proving I still had something to offer. But late at night, alone in my study while Evelyn slept upstairs and the house creaked around me, I'd think about that sensation I'd felt in the hotel bar, the heat rising to my face, the way Adrian had looked at me like he could see through all the careful layers I'd built, the message I still hadn't deleted. I'd take off my wedding ring and set it on my desk just to see what it felt like, just to remind myself that it could come off, that it wasn't permanent, wasn't fused to my skin, wasn't who I was. and then I'd slip it back on and go to bed and wake up the next morning and do it all again. Because that's what you did. That's what responsible men did. You honored your commitments. You kept your promises. You didn't unravel your entire life because a stranger made you blush in a hotel bar. You didn't let yourself wonder what it would feel like to be seen. The collaboration began the way these things always do: formal, professional, distant. Zoom calls scheduled weeks in advance. Design reviews where we spoke in the careful language of architects, all structure and no feeling. Drafts passed back and forth through email with polite subject lines and measured feedback. Adrian's firm had a reputation for innovative work, for pushing boundaries while staying grounded in practical reality. I'd studied their portfolio before our first meeting, impressed by the way they balanced ambition with restraint. Adrian himself had designed a library in Savannah that I'd visited once, years ago, and I remembered standing in its atrium feeling something close to envy. Not jealousy, envy. The sense that someone else was doing the work I'd once dreamed of doing. Our early exchanges were exactly what they should have been. He'd send me his thoughts on the museum's flow, the way visitors should move through space. I'd respond with structural concerns, budget constraints, the practical limitations that always tempered vision. We were professionals, colleagues, two people working toward a common goal. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first. His emails grew longer, more thoughtful. He'd include observations that went beyond the work, a reference to a book he thought I'd like, a question about a detail in one of my sketches that he'd noticed in a shared file. He asked me once what had drawn me to architecture in the first place, and I found myself writing a response that stretched to 3 paragraphs, telling him about the summer I was 12 and my father took me to see falling water, how I'd stood there watching the house rise from the waterfall and understood for the first time that buildings could be alive. He wrote back immediately. He said he'd felt the same thing the first time he saw the Pantheon, how the light pouring through the oculus made him believe in something he couldn't name. We started texting, just about work at first, quick questions, clarifications that were easier to handle over message than email. But then the texts came later in the evening, after dinner, after Evelyn had gone to bed and Lydia was asleep, and I was alone in my study with a glass of wine I didn't really want. He'd ask about my day. I'd tell him about the drawings I'd done at the harbor over the weekend. He'd share a photo of a building he'd passed in Atlanta, something Art Deco with perfect symmetry, and I'd study it longer than necessary, trying to see it the way he saw it. Our conversations drifted. We talked about music. He liked jazz, the old standards, the same albums my father used to play. We talked about loneliness, carefully, the way you do when you're not ready to admit how much of it you carry. We shared small memories that had no place in polite conversation, the kind of details you only tell people who won't judge you for them. I found myself waiting for his name to light up my screen, checking my phone more often than I should, composing messages in my head throughout the day, practicing what I'd say, how I'd sound, whether I should include the detail about the heron I'd seen at the harbor or if that was too much, too personal, too revealing. Evelyn noticed. She asked me once if I was stressed about the project. I told her it was challenging but exciting. She smiled, said she was glad I'd found something that engaged me again, and went back to reading her book. She didn't ask anything else. She never did. When the museum board arranged an on-site week for the design teams, a full week of in-person collaboration to finalize the concept before we moved to detailed design, Adrian came to Charleston. I'd known he was coming. We'd discussed the logistics over email, professional and proper. But when I saw him in the lobby of our office building that first morning, standing in a pool of sunlight with his leather portfolio bag and that same slightly too long hair, I felt my pulse quicken in a way I couldn't rationalize. Our first meeting was ordinary. The room was full of people, my partners, his associates, the museum's project manager, an interior designer who talked too much. We presented our concepts, discussed timelines and budgets, debated materials and sight lines. Adrian sat across the conference table, taking notes, asking intelligent questions, being exactly what he was supposed to be. But every time our eyes met, something passed between us that no one else could see. The week unfolded in a blur of meetings and revisions. We worked long days, staying late at the office, ordering takeout, and spreading drawings across every available surface. The rest of the team treated it like what it was, a sprint toward a deadline. But for Adrian and me, every interaction felt weighted with meaning. After one particularly exhausting day, when everyone else had finally gone home and we'd just finished addressing the board's latest round of feedback, we found ourselves at the same bar. Not the hotel bar where we'd first met. This was a place downtown, small and dark, the kind of spot where locals went to disappear for a while. We didn't plan it. I'd mentioned I needed a drink before heading home. He said he knew the feeling. And suddenly we were sitting side by side in a corner booth, bourbon in front of us, the noise of the bar creating a pocket of privacy around us. The conversation was easy again, the way it had been that first night. But now there was history between us. Weeks of messages, of late-night calls, of confessions disguised as casual observations. We talked about the project, but we both knew that wasn't why we were there. He said something about my eye for detail, how I noticed things other people missed. I brushed it off. He said no, really, that it was rare, that most architects got so focused on the big picture they forgot about the moments that mattered. He said my voice was still the calmest thing he'd heard in years. I felt the heat rise to my face again, that same flush I couldn't control. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out wrong. Too soft, too uncertain. Adrian caught it. He smiled, not mocking, not amused, but gentle, knowing. He said I blushed like someone who wasn't used to being seen. I didn't know what to say to that. I stared at my drink, at the amber liquid catching the light, and felt something crack inside me. When I finally looked up, he was still watching me with that same steady gaze, and for a moment I thought I might tell him everything. About Evelyn. About the life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like slow suffocation. About the years I'd spent trying to be the person everyone needed me to be. But I didn't. I just finished my drink and told him I should get home. He nodded, didn't push. We walked to the parking garage together, the streets empty and quiet, our footsteps echoing. When we reached my car, I turned to say goodnight and found him standing closer than I expected. He said my name, Julian, just that, my name in his voice, soft and certain. I felt my breath catch. He said maybe next time he was in Charleston, I could show him my favorite sketch spots. The real ones, not the tourist places. I smiled too easily. I told him I'd like that. We shook hands again, professional, appropriate, meaningless. But this time when I drove away, I could still feel the warmth of his palm against mine, could still hear the way he'd said my name like it was something worth holding on to. That night, I didn't take off my wedding ring. I left it on, tight and uncomfortable, a reminder of all the promises I'd made. But I also didn't delete his messages. And when my phone lit up an hour later with a text that said thank you for tonight, I wrote back you're welcome and felt my hands tremble as I pressed send. I knew what was happening. I knew what I was allowing. I knew I should stop. But I also knew I wouldn't. After Adrian left Charleston, our connection didn't fade the way I'd half hoped it would. Instead, it deepened, quietly, inevitably, like roots spreading beneath concrete. The texts continued, but they were different now, less careful, more honest. He'd send me photos of his morning coffee, of the skyline from his apartment window, of a dog he'd seen in the park that reminded him of one he'd had as a kid. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of details you only share with someone you want to let in. I found myself doing the same, sending him pictures of the harbor at sunrise, of a building facade I discovered on a side street, of Lydia's latest sketch. She'd drawn our house from memory and gotten the proportions almost perfect. He wrote back immediately, asking about her, about whether she'd inherit my talent. I told him she was better than I'd ever been. The texts evolved into phone calls. Late at night, when the house was silent and I could slip out to my study and close the door and speak in low tones that wouldn't carry upstairs. We'd talk for hours, our conversations wandering from architecture to everything else. Childhood memories, regrets we'd never spoken aloud, the particular loneliness of building a life that looked right but felt hollow. He told me about growing up in a small town in North Carolina, about knowing from an early age that he was different, about the years he'd spent trying to sand down the edges of himself until he fit into the shape people expected. He told me about his first love, a boy named Marcus who he'd met in college, how they'd been together for 3 years before Marcus took a job in California and Adrian was too afraid to follow. He said he'd spent the last decade wondering what would have happened if he'd been brave enough to choose love over safety. I listened, my chest tight, recognizing myself in every word. Then came the video calls. We'd start them under the pretense of reviewing drawings, of discussing some detail of the museum design that required visual explanation. But the drawings would sit forgotten on our screens while we talked, our faces illuminated by the blue glow of our laptops, creating an intimacy that felt both safer and more dangerous than being in the same room. I started drawing again, really drawing, not just technical sketches but the kind of work I'd done in grad school, atmospheric, emotional, more about feeling than precision. I'd draw late into the night, lose myself in charcoal and shadow, and then photograph the results and send them to Adrian before I could second-guess myself. He responded with admiration that felt like confession. He said I saw things the way he felt them, that my drawings captured not just light and form but the weight of time, the presence of memory. He said looking at my work made him understand why he'd become an architect in the first place. No one had spoken about my drawings like that in years. Evelyn praised them absently when she noticed them, the way you'd compliment a child's finger painting. My colleagues saw them as a quirk, irrelevant to the real work. But Adrian understood. He saw what I was trying to say in every line. At home, I became a ghost. I moved through my routines mechanically, making breakfast, driving Lydia to school, sitting through meetings at the firm, coming home to dinners where Evelyn talked about her day, and I nodded and contributed nothing. I was there, but not there, present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. Evelyn noticed. Of course she noticed. She asked if I was feeling all right, if the project was too stressful, if I needed to see a doctor. I told her I was fine, just tired, just preoccupied with work. She accepted the lie because it was easier than pushing, because we'd built our marriage on the foundation of not asking difficult questions. But I caught her watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't read, concern, maybe, or suspicion, or the dawning realization that the distance between us had become something that couldn't be bridged by good intentions alone. Lydia asked me once why I was quieter than usual. We were in the car, driving home from school, the afternoon sun slanting through the windshield. She said it wasn't a bad thing, that I was always quiet, but that lately I seemed sad. I told her I wasn't sad, just thinking about work. She nodded, went back to her book, but I saw the way she glanced at me in the rearview mirror, uncertain, and I hated myself for making my daughter worry. When Adrian returned to Charleston for another site visit, this time just for a long weekend to review the schematic design with the museum board, I felt something shift inside me, an anticipation that bordered on desperation. I told Evelyn I'd be working long hours, that the presentation was critical, that I might need to stay late at the office or grab dinner with the team. She said she understood, kissed me on the cheek in that automatic way we'd perfected, told me to do what I needed to do. Adrian and I spent Saturday afternoon at the harbor. It wasn't planned, not officially. The presentation was Sunday. We were supposed to be preparing. But I'd mentioned my sketch spot once, months ago, and he'd remembered. And when he suggested we go there to clear our heads before the meeting, I agreed before I could think better of it. We sat side by side on my usual bench, sketchbooks open, the water stretching out before us in the late autumn light. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the salt smell of the ocean. Tourists wandered past, but we barely noticed them. For a while we didn't talk at all, just drew, our pencils scratching against paper in a rhythm that felt like conversation. I was hyper-aware of his presence beside me. The space between us, 6 inches, maybe less, felt electric, charged with possibility. Every accidental brush of his shoulder against mine sent a jolt through me that I tried to ignore. At some point he leaned over to look at my sketch. His arm pressed against mine, warm even through our jackets. He studied the drawing, a half-finished rendering of the customs house, all shadow and suggestion, and said it was beautiful. that I made everything look like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned to look at him. He was closer than I expected, his face inches from mine, and I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count his eyelashes if I wanted to. Neither of us moved away. He said my name again, that same soft certainty, and I felt something inside me give way entirely. Our hands found each other on the bench between us. Not dramatically, not with any conscious decision. His fingers just drifted toward mine, and suddenly we were touching, palms pressed together, and the relief of it was so overwhelming I almost gasped. We sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding hands like teenagers while the sun sank lower and the tourists thinned and the world continued around us, oblivious. When we finally stood to leave, the spell didn't break. We walked back to the parking garage slowly, our shoulders brushing with every step. Neither of us suggested dinner with the team. Neither of us pretended we should go our separate ways. Instead, we drove to a restaurant outside the city, a quiet place by the water where no one from the firm would see us. We sat across from each other in a corner booth and ordered food we barely touched. The conversation was different than it had been before, not careful anymore, not guarded. We talked about fear, about the cost of living a life that wasn't yours, about the particular kind of suffocation that came from being exactly who everyone expected you to be. Adrian told me he'd been in love twice. Once with Marcus, the boy who got away, and once more, years later, with a man named Daniel who he'd dated for 6 months before realizing he was trying to recreate something that couldn't be forced. He said he'd been single for 3 years, had convinced himself he was fine with it, had built a life around work and solitude and the occasional meaningless connection that left him emptier than before. He said meeting me had reminded him what it felt like to want something real. I couldn't respond to that. My throat was too tight. Instead, I told him about my marriage, about Evelyn, about the creeping realization that I'd married her not because I loved her, but because it was what I was supposed to do. I told him I'd never questioned my sexuality, not seriously, had simply assumed the absence of passion with Evelyn was normal, that everyone felt that way, that desire was something people exaggerated in movies. I told him I'd never felt what I was feeling now. After dinner, we sat in my car in the empty parking lot. The restaurant closed behind us, the marsh grass swaying in the darkness beyond the window. We talked until our voices grew hoarse. We talked until there was nothing left to say except the truth we were both circling. Adrian said, almost whispering, that I always looked like I was holding my breath, that he wanted to know what it would feel like if I let myself exhale. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry or run. I sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, feeling the weight of my wedding ring like an anchor. He didn't push. He just sat beside me in the darkness, patient, waiting. Finally, I turned to look at him. He was watching me with such gentleness it hurt. I said I didn't know how to do this, how to be this, how to want what I wanted. He said he didn't either, that we could figure it out together, or not, that he wouldn't ask for more than I could give. But we both knew that was a lie. We both knew we were already past the point of careful boundaries. When I drove him back to his hotel, we sat in the parking lot for another hour, not touching, just talking in low voices while the dashboard clock ticked past midnight. When he finally opened the door to leave, he paused, turned back, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me. But he didn't. He just said goodnight, said he'd see me tomorrow at the presentation, and walked away. I sat in my car long after he'd gone, the engine off, the silence pressing in around me. My phone buzzed. A text from Evelyn asking if I was on my way home. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I started the car and drove through the empty streets, my wedding ring burning against my skin, and wondered how much longer I could keep pretending I was the man everyone thought I was. For the first time in my life, someone had seen me, really seen me, and now I couldn't unsee myself. The storm came 3 weeks later, in early December, just as the project was entering its most critical phase. The kind of storm that shuts down a city, power lines down, flights canceled, streets flooded. The museum board postponed our review meeting. Half the team couldn't make it to the office. And Adrian, who'd flown in that morning for what was supposed to be a 2-day trip, found himself stranded. His hotel lost power around 8 that evening. I was home when he texted me, trying to keep it light, joking about sitting in the dark with a dead laptop and melting ice from the minibar. But I could read between the lines. I could hear the loneliness in the spaces between his words. Evelyn was upstairs putting Lydia to bed. I stood in the kitchen, staring at my phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought she might hear it from the second floor. I told him I was sorry, that the power would probably come back soon. He said it was fine, that he'd survive. Then he sent another message. Said he had some printed drawings we could review if I wanted to stop by, that we might as well make use of the downtime. We both knew what he was really asking. I told Evelyn I needed to go back to the office, that there were documents I'd forgotten, that with the meeting postponed we couldn't afford to lose momentum. She looked at me for a long moment, and I wondered if she could see through me, if she knew. But then she just nodded, told me to drive carefully, said the roads would be dangerous in the storm. I drove through sheets of rain, my headlights barely cutting through the darkness. The city looked abandoned, traffic lights out, buildings dark, only a few emergency vehicles moving through the flooded streets. It should have felt ominous. Instead, it felt like permission. Adrian's hotel had backup generators in the lobby, but the upper floors were dark. I found him in his room on the 6th floor, candles scattered across the desk and nightstand, their light casting shadows that moved like living things across the walls. He'd changed out of his work clothes into jeans and a sweater. His hair was still damp from a shower taken in darkness. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, soaked from the rain, something passed across his face. Surprise, relief, something deeper I didn't have a name for. He said he didn't actually think I'd come. I said I didn't either. We stood there in the doorway for a moment that stretched too long, the rain hammering against the window behind him, the candlelight making everything feel unreal, borrowed, like we'd stepped outside of time. He moved aside to let me in. I stepped past him into the small room and heard the door click shut behind me and felt the weight of that sound in my chest. For a while we tried to pretend. We spread the drawings across the bed, leaned over them with our phones providing additional light, discussed sight lines and material choices and structural concerns. But our voices were too quiet, too uncertain. We were going through the motions of a ritual neither of us believed in anymore. Eventually we stopped pretending. We sat on the edge of the bed, the drawings forgotten between us, and just talked. Really talked. The kind of conversation you can only have in the dark, when you can't quite see the other person's face, when the shadows give you permission to be honest. Adrian told me about the first time he'd kissed a man. He was 19, drunk at a college party, and it was clumsy and brief and terrifying and the most right thing he'd ever felt. He said he'd spent the next year trying to convince himself it didn't mean anything, that it was just experimentation, that he could still be the person his parents wanted him to be. He said he'd wasted so much time being afraid. I told him I'd never kissed a man, never even thought about it, not consciously, not in any way I'd allowed myself to examine. I told him about the nights I'd lie awake next to Evelyn, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was disappearing, like I was slowly erasing myself to make room for the person everyone needed me to be. I told him I was tired of disappearing. He reached for my hand in the darkness. This time I didn't hesitate. Our fingers laced together, and I felt tears sting my eyes because something that simple shouldn't have felt like coming home. He told me about Marcus again, about the way they'd ended, not with a fight, but with silence, with Marcus packing his car in the driveway while Adrian watched from the window, too paralyzed by fear to ask him to stay. He said he'd spent years telling himself it was the practical choice, the smart choice, that long-distance relationships never worked anyway. He said it was the biggest mistake of his life. I asked him if he regretted it. He said every day. He said that's why he'd promised himself he'd never make the same mistake again, never let fear stop him from reaching for something real. The rain had gotten louder, violent almost, pounding against the window like it was trying to break through. The candlelight flickered. The room felt smaller, warmer, like the storm had enclosed us in something separate from the rest of the world. I don't know who moved first. Maybe both of us. Maybe neither. But suddenly the space between us had disappeared and his hand was on my face. Gentle, trembling, and I was leaning into his touch like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater and had finally found the surface. He said my name, Julian, a question and an answer. I said yes before I knew what I was agreeing to. When we kissed, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the earth-shattering moment I'd seen in movies, the kind of kiss that rewrites your understanding of desire. It was soft, tentative, uncertain, two people trying to find a rhythm they'd never learned. But it was real. God, it was real. More real than anything I'd felt in years. His lips were warm, and he tasted like the wine we'd been drinking, and when he pulled back to look at me, his eyes searching mine for doubt or regret, all I could think was that I wanted to do it again. So I did. The second kiss was deeper, more certain. My hands found his hair, and his arms wrapped around me, and suddenly we were holding each other like we were trying to merge, like we could somehow press ourselves together hard enough to erase the years of loneliness that had brought us here. We kissed until I lost track of time, until the candles burned low and the storm reached its peak and began to fade. We kissed until my lips were numb and my heart was racing and every nerve in my body felt alive in a way I hadn't known was possible. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, I pressed my forehead against his and closed my eyes and tried to memorize everything. The feel of his hands on my back, the sound of his breathing, the smell of rain and candle wax, and something else that was just him. He whispered that he'd been wanting to do that since the first night we met. I laughed, shaky and breathless, and told him I'd been wanting it too. I just hadn't known it yet. We lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, still holding each other, the drawings crumpled beneath us. We didn't sleep. We just lay there in the candlelight, talking in whispers, stealing kisses like teenagers, marveling at the simple fact of being seen and held and wanted. The power came back around 4 in the morning. The lights blazed on, harsh and sudden, shattering the spell. We both flinched, blinking in the brightness, and suddenly the room looked ordinary again. Just a hotel room, impersonal and temporary. The magic dissolved. I sat up, my heart sinking, reality crashing back in. I had a wife at home, a daughter, a life built on promises I'd made in good faith. I'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Adrian sat up beside me, his hand finding mine again, anchoring me. He said we didn't have to figure everything out tonight, that we could take this one moment at a time. But I knew better. I knew that one moment had already changed everything. When I left, the storm had passed, and the city was beginning to wake. I drove home through the gray light of early morning, my lips still tingling, my wedding ring still on my finger, and felt like I'd been split in two. The man driving this car, and the man I'd left behind in that hotel room. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Terrified, guilty, confused, but alive. And I knew, with a clarity that both freed and destroyed me, that I couldn't go back to the person I'd been before. Back home, I moved through my life like a ghost, like something that occupied space but had no substance, no weight, no real presence. I went through all the motions, made breakfast, drove Lydia to school, sat in meetings, nodded at appropriate moments, but I wasn't really there. Part of me was still in that hotel room, wrapped in candlelight and possibility. Evelyn noticed. Of course she noticed. She'd always been perceptive, had always been able to read the small shifts in my mood, even when I tried to hide them. But for years she'd chosen not to push, had let me retreat into my silences without demanding explanations. This time was different. Lydia asked me one morning why I seemed sad. We were having breakfast before school, just the two of us. Evelyn had already left for work. She looked at me over her cereal bowl with those serious eyes that saw too much, and said I'd been quiet for weeks, that even when I was talking I seemed far away. I told her I was fine, just stressed about the museum project. She nodded but didn't believe me. I could see it in the way she watched me after that, cautious, uncertain, like she was trying to understand what had changed. I hated myself for making my daughter worry, hated that my unraveling was something she could sense even when I tried to hide it. Adrian and I tried not to contact each other. We agreed it was necessary, that we needed space to think, to figure out what we'd done and what it meant. The project gave us an excuse. The design was approved, moving into the next phase. and we could coordinate through our teams without speaking directly. But the silence lasted less than a week. He texted me first. Just 3 words. I miss you. I stared at those words for an hour before responding. I miss you too. After that, the messages came in a flood. We couldn't stop. We tried to be careful, tried to keep our conversations brief and practical, but every exchange pulled us deeper. We'd text late at night when we should have been sleeping. We'd call when we knew we shouldn't. We'd send each other photos that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to us. An empty coffee cup, a building at dusk, a page from a sketchbook. We were like addicts, unable to stay away even though we knew every contact made everything harder. I stopped sleeping. I'd lie awake next to Evelyn, my phone hidden under my pillow, feeling it buzz with Adrian's messages and knowing I should ignore them, but reaching for it anyway. I'd read his words in the darkness and feel my chest constrict with longing and guilt in equal measure. During the day, I was exhausted, distracted, barely functional. My partners asked if I was feeling all right. I told them I wasn't sleeping well, that I should probably see a doctor. They suggested I take some time off. I said I couldn't, not with the museum project at such a critical stage. The truth was I couldn't stop. Couldn't step away from the work because it was my only connection to Adrian, the only excuse I had for the way his name appeared in my phone, in my email, in every corner of my life. Evelyn found the sketch on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd left my notebook on the kitchen counter. Careless, stupid, a mistake I wouldn't have made if I'd been thinking clearly. She'd flipped through it, probably just curious, probably not looking for anything in particular. But there it was. A drawing I'd done weeks ago, after that afternoon at the harbor. 2 figures standing side by side on a bench, their bodies angled toward each other, their hands almost touching. You couldn't see their faces. It was all suggestion, shadow, the space between things. But the intimacy was unmistakable. When I came home from work, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her. She didn't look angry. She looked tired, sad, like she'd been expecting this for a long time and was almost relieved to finally have confirmation. She asked, very quietly, who he was. I stood in the doorway, my briefcase still in my hand, and felt everything inside me collapse. I couldn't lie. Not anymore. Not to her. She deserved better than that. I told her his name. Told her he was the architect on the museum project. Told her we'd become close. That it had started as friendship and become something else. Something I hadn't planned and didn't know how to explain. She asked if I loved him. I couldn't answer. The word felt too big, too complicated, too freighted with meanings I hadn't begun to sort through. But my silence was answer enough. She asked if I'd slept with him. I told her no, not in the way she meant, but that we'd kissed, that I'd crossed lines I couldn't uncross. She nodded slowly, like she was processing information she'd suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. She asked if I'd ever loved her. I told her the truth, that I had, in my way, but that I'd never understood what I was capable of feeling until Adrian. That I'd married her believing the quiet contentment we shared was what love was supposed to be. That I'd been wrong, and that wasn't her fault, and I was sorry. She started crying. Not loud, dramatic sobs, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks while she sat perfectly still at the kitchen table. She said she'd known something was wrong for years, that our marriage had been dying slowly, that she'd tried to ignore it because it was easier than facing it. She said she'd been lonely too. We talked for hours that night. About our marriage, about the lies we'd told ourselves, about the years we'd wasted trying to be people we weren't. She asked me questions I didn't have good answers to. About when I'd known. About whether I'd ever been attracted to her. About what happened now. I told her I didn't know. That I was still trying to understand what was happening to me, what I wanted, who I was underneath all the roles I'd been playing. She asked if I was gay. I told her I didn't know that either. That labels felt too simple for what I was feeling. That all I knew was that Adrian had woken something in me I hadn't known was sleeping. She said she needed time to think. That she couldn't make any decisions tonight. That this was too big to process all at once. She said she'd sleep in the guest room. She asked me not to contact Adrian until we'd figured out what we were going to do. I agreed. knowing even as I did that it was a promise I might not be able to keep. That night, I drove to the harbor. It was late, past midnight, the city quiet and dark around me. I sat on my bench, our bench, and stared at the water and tried to understand how my life had come apart so quickly. I called Adrian. I didn't plan to. I'd promised Evelyn I wouldn't. But I needed to hear his voice, needed some anchor in the storm that was consuming me. He answered on the first ring, said my name like a question. I didn't speak. Couldn't. I just held the phone to my ear and listened to him breathing, listened to the sound of the ocean in front of me, and felt tears run down my face. He didn't push. He just stayed on the line, patient, present, waiting for me to find words. Finally, he asked what I wanted, what I really wanted, beneath all the fear and guilt and confusion. I sat there in the darkness, the phone pressed to my ear, and felt the truth rise up in me like water breaking through a dam. I whispered that I wanted to stop lying. To him, to Evelyn, to myself. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of a future together. It was simpler and harder than that. It was a surrender. He said he understood, that whatever I decided, he'd respect it, that he wasn't asking me to blow up my life for him, that he just wanted me to be honest about who I was. We stayed on the phone for another hour, not saying much, just being together in the silence. When we finally hung up, I sat in my car and watched the sun start to rise over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I thought about Lydia, about how I'd explain this to her, about whether she'd understand or hate me. I thought about Evelyn, about the life we'd built together, about the years we'd spent in that beautiful, empty house. I thought about Adrian, about the way he'd looked at me in the candlelight, about the possibility of becoming someone new. I thought about my wedding ring, still on my finger, the metal warm from my skin. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I couldn't keep wearing it. Not anymore. Not if I wanted to finally know what it felt like to breathe. The separation happened quietly. No lawyers at first, no dramatic scenes. Just two people who'd run out of reasons to stay married acknowledging what had been true for years. Evelyn kept the house. I didn't fight her for it. That beautiful, empty museum had never really been mine anyway. Lydia stayed with her mother. We agreed on custody arrangements that felt fair even though nothing about the situation was fair to her. She took it better than I expected, not with understanding, exactly, but with a kind of resigned acceptance that broke my heart. She said she'd known something was wrong, that she'd felt the distance growing. She asked if I still loved her. I told her always that nothing about this changed how I felt about her, that she was the best thing I'd ever done. She asked if I was happy now. I told her I was trying to be honest, and that was a start. I moved into a small apartment downtown, a third-floor walk-up with hardwood floors and tall windows that let in good light. It was sparse, almost monastic, a bed, a desk, a worn leather chair I'd bought at an estate sale. The walls were bare except for one framed sketch I'd done of the harbor at dusk, the one Adrian had always said was his favorite. It felt like starting over, like being stripped down to nothing and having to figure out who I was without all the roles and responsibilities that had defined me. Adrian visited once, months later. The museum was nearly complete by then, the project winding down, our professional relationship coming to its natural end. He flew in for the final walkthrough, and afterward we had coffee at a place near my apartment. It was strange, seeing him in person again after so many months of carefully maintained distance. We'd kept in touch, texts here and there, brief and careful, but we'd both known we needed space to let the dust settle, to let me figure out who I was outside of the wreckage of my marriage. He looked good. Tired, maybe, but good. He told me about a project he'd taken on in Nashville, a renovation of an old theater. He said it was challenging, consuming, exactly what he'd needed. I told him about the apartment, about learning to cook for one, about the custody schedule with Lydia that was slowly becoming routine. I told him I'd been drawing more, that I'd even started painting, something I hadn't done since college. We didn't talk about us, about what had happened between us, about what it meant, about whether there was still something there beneath all the time and distance. But the air between us held that familiar weight, that recognition, that sense of being seen. When the sun started to set, I asked if he wanted to see the museum before he left. We walked there together through the cooling evening, our footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalks. The building glowed in the dusk light, its glass facade reflecting the pink and orange sky. Inside, the atrium was magnificent, exactly as we designed it. Lights spilling across the marble floor in geometric patterns, the space opening up above us in a way that made you feel both small and significant. We stood there in silence, looking at what we'd created together, and I felt something like pride for the first time in months. Adrian said it was perfect, that all the struggle had been worth it. I told him I agreed. We walked through the gallery slowly, our voices low, careful. He pointed out details I'd forgotten we'd fought for: the angle of a wall, the placement of a window, the way the natural light would change throughout the day. I listened to him talk and remembered why I'd fallen into architecture in the first place. Remembered that buildings could tell stories if you listened closely enough. When we reached the terrace overlooking the harbor, the place where we'd first sketched together, we stood side by side at the railing and watched the water darken as night fell. He asked how I was. Really, I told him the truth, that I was still figuring it out, that some days were harder than others, that I felt guilty about Lydia, about Evelyn, about the damage I'd caused, but that I also felt like I could finally breathe, like I'd stopped living someone else's life. He said he was proud of me, that it took courage to choose honesty over comfort. I told him I didn't feel courageous, just tired, and maybe a little more myself than I'd been before. We stood there in the fading light, the city spreading out below us, and I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out. A text from Adrian, even though he was standing right beside me. "I still see that look on you." I read it twice, then looked at him. He was smiling, soft and uncertain, and I realized he was giving me permission. Permission to step forward or step back, to reach for him or let him go, to choose whatever came next without pressure or expectation. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, feeling the weight of the decision, feeling all the possible futures branching out from this single moment. Then I smiled, faint but real, and I slipped my phone back into my pocket. I didn't reach for him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That wasn't what this moment was about. It was about standing on a terrace I'd helped design, in a city I'd lived in my whole life, finally unafraid of my own reflection. It was about understanding that the story didn't need a grand romance to matter. It just needed honesty. We left the museum together and walked back into the cooling evening. He had a flight to catch. I had an empty apartment waiting. We said goodbye at the corner where our paths diverged, and this time when we shook hands it felt like neither an ending nor a beginning. Just a moment, real and sufficient. I walked home alone through the twilight. The indentation on my finger finally faded, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness, not yet. Maybe never in the way I'd once imagined it. But peace. The quiet knowledge that I was finally living a life that was mine. And for now, that was enough.